What happens when the very people sworn to protect the state suddenly refuse to obey their commanders? In Kenya, on a day marked by protests and unrest, riot police faced an order to shoot and incapacitate. But in a rare act of defiance, they chose humanity over obedience, and in doing so, ignited a national conversation about the morality of power, public trust, and what it means to serve the people. For weeks, the streets of Kenya had been ablaze with protests. The people, disillusioned by rising fuel prices, soaring food costs, and a government mired in corruption, had taken to the streets. The tragic death of activist Albert Ojwang, allegedly at the hands of police, served as the tipping point. What started as a protest over one man's death quickly snowballed into a nationwide outcry, demanding justice, transparency, and a break from years of unchecked political manipulation. But then came the order that would change everything. Amidst the chaos, riot police were reportedly told to use lethal force on protesters, aiming for their legs as a means of control. This hardline approach was not new. Kenya's police force had long been notorious for responding to dissent with brute force, often resulting in violence and tragedy. But this time, something unexpected happened. As the order was relayed to the officers on the ground, instead of following suit, a number of them simply refused to act. At one protest site, a chilling moment was witnessed. Riot police stood silently, listening to orders on their radios, only to shake their heads and lower their weapons. A voice from the crowd could be heard shouting, "We will not shoot our people." For the protesters, the chant quickly shifted from anger to shock, and then to applause. It was an unthinkable act of defiance, one that would go viral across the globe, sparking both celebration and controversy. For many, this was a powerful moment. Proof that the police were no longer just tools of the state's violence, but had recognized their responsibility to the people they were meant to protect. However, for others, particularly within the political elite, it was an alarming breakdown of authority, a dangerous precedent that could spark further unrest. Despite government reassurances that there had been no official order to shoot to kill, the videos continued to circulate. Independent human rights groups soon confirmed that similar orders had been issued in multiple countries, painting this refusal as part of a larger, continental movement. A movement of police forces rethinking their role in society. The officers' defiance wasn't just a matter of saving lives. It was about rejecting a long-standing tradition of politicized policing, one that often saw officers as enforcers for whichever political faction held power. The world watched in awe, but why did they defy the order? Kenya's police force has always been heavily scrutinized, especially given its long history of violence against civilians. Yet, despite years of negative public perception, a shift was beginning to take hold. Officers, particularly younger ones, had entered the force with promises of reform. They had been taught new methods of crowd control, methods focused on de-escalation and non-lethal measures. These newer officers had come of age in a time of growing social media awareness and international accountability. For them, the order to shoot protesters felt like a betrayal of the very reforms they had been taught to uphold. It was a direct challenge to their oath to protect and serve, and to the human rights they had sworn to uphold. Legal experts weighed in, emphasizing that Kenyan law, as well as international human rights conventions, strictly limited the use of force to cases where there was an imminent threat to life, not for simple acts of protest or vandalism. In a rare public statement, the Kenyan National Commission on Human Rights warned that following such orders could expose officers to criminal liability, even if they were just following orders. The political context of these events was undeniable. With the country already on edge, having witnessed days of civil unrest, the government's instructions felt like a dangerous escalation, a move that could spark uncontrollable violence. As the protests raged on, the police's refusal to follow orders became a symbolic victory. For the protesters, it was a sign that the police could no longer be seen as mere tools of state violence. For the younger officers who had grown disillusioned with the status quo, it was a moment of moral clarity, one that reflected a shift in consciousness. They were no longer just serving a political agenda, they were protecting their fellow citizens. But this moment did not exist in a vacuum. Across Africa, a shift was taking place, one that went far beyond just the Kenyan protests. The growing influence of reformist leaders like Ibrahim Traoré, the young transitional president of Burkina Faso, symbolized a radical departure from the continent's past of political violence and authoritarian rule. Traoré's powerful commitment to never shedding the blood of his people to maintain power was a bold stance that resonated deeply with a new generation of African youth and security personnel. His message, focused on unity, national self-reliance, and citizen protection, was more than just a political ideology. It was a call for a new kind of leadership and governance, one that placed the well-being of citizens above the preservation of power at any cost. This shift in mindset became a rallying cry for reform-minded officers and citizens across Africa. Traoré's commitment to self-reliance and peaceful governance struck a chord with those who had long been frustrated by the deep-rooted corruption and brutality that marked the relationship between security forces and the people they were meant to protect. As Kenya faced its own wave of protests, it became clear that the younger police officers, those raised in a time of digital transparency, global interconnectedness, and human rights awareness, could not ignore the growing influence of this Pan-African ethos. Whether they were consciously aware of Traoré's influence or not, their decision to refuse to follow orders aligned perfectly with this broader movement. In Kenya, this act of defiance was a defining moment. It wasn't just a refusal to shoot, it was an acknowledgement of the shifting moral and ethical values that were beginning to permeate African security forces. These officers were no longer willing to be pawns in a political game that demanded violence against their fellow citizens. Instead, they were beginning to recognize that their duty was to the people, not the political elite. State power, they realized, need not come at the expense of human life. This understanding represented a turning point, not just for Kenya but for the entire African continent. For decades, Africa's policing cultures had been shaped by fear, obedience, and authoritarianism. Police forces had often been tasked with protecting political interests, maintaining order at all costs, and suppressing dissent with brute force. But this refusal to shoot at protesters exposed deep fractures in this culture, fractures that had been slowly but surely eroding the foundations of authoritarian rule. Officers, who once acted as mere instruments of state power, were now choosing to stand with the people. They were acting not out of fear or coercion, but driven by a deep sense of ethics, accountability, and the desire to protect human rights. This moral shift was not without its risks. The officers who chose to lay down their weapons faced potential disciplinary action, suspension, or even dismissal. They were well aware that their refusal would likely draw the ire of political leaders and could jeopardize their careers. Yet, despite these risks, they stood firm in their conviction. For them, this decision was not just about following or disobeying orders, it was about choosing who they truly served. Was their duty to the political elite, the same powers that had long used them as tools to suppress the people? Or was it to the citizens of Kenya, who were demanding justice, accountability, and a government that served them? This decision marked a critical shift in the way security forces saw their roles within society. It was not just about enforcing the will of the state, it was about protecting the fundamental rights of the people, even when those rights were being exercised through protests and dissent. These officers, in rejecting violence, set a precedent for how policing could evolve in Africa, moving from an instrument of political control to a guardian of public trust. Their act of defiance didn't just shake the Kenyan government. It reverberated across the continent, sending a message that Africa's security forces could no longer be instruments of oppression. As social movements, reform-minded leaders, and activists gained more traction, the broader Pan-African shift became inevitable. The police in Kenya, and other African nations, could no longer remain passive agents of violence. They were forced to reckon with a changing world, one where transparency, ethical responsibility, and respect for human rights were not optional but essential for a functioning democracy. In Kenya, the act of laying down arms was a choice to stand with the people, to affirm that justice, human dignity, and accountability would no longer be secondary to political or state interests. The question now remains, will this act of conscience inspire systemic reform, or will it provoke a backlash that seeks to restore the old ways of authoritarian control? This moment has already changed the trajectory of Kenya's policing culture and the wider African security landscape, and its full impact has yet to unfold. But the implications for democracy, public trust, and human rights are undeniable. This turning point in Kenya will not only affect the future of African policing but could also lay the foundation for a new kind of African governance, one based on people power, accountability, and respect for life. Could this be the beginning of a new era for Africa's security forces? The events in Kenya were not an isolated incident. Across the continent, security forces have begun questioning their role in suppressing civil unrest. For decades, African police forces were primarily viewed as enforcers of government authority, tasked with quelling any dissent and maintaining political control. However, the political landscape is rapidly shifting, and officers are increasingly being exposed to alternative philosophies of governance, such as those championed by Ibrahim Traoré. The people-first approach, which prioritizes citizens' well-being over the preservation of political power, is growing in influence. Leaders like Traoré, who pledged never to shed the blood of his people to stay in power, have inspired a wave of reform-minded officers across the continent. From Nigeria to Ghana and South Africa, this moral shift is challenging the entrenched authoritarian methods that have long been used to control the masses. For younger police officers, particularly those who have been raised in the age of social media, instant accountability, and globalized human rights movements, the idea of protecting civilians rather than suppressing them resonates deeply. They are more willing to question orders, re-evaluate their role in society, and adopt new methods of policing that emphasize protection over punishment. As Kenya's police force stands at this crossroads, the question remains: will this moment of conscience lead to systemic reform, or will it trigger a backlash that forces officers back into the old ways? The political elite, historically reliant on the militarization of police forces to maintain control, may resist this change, fearing a loss of authority and influence. However, the increasing global pressure for human rights, transparency, and accountability will make it increasingly difficult to ignore the moral shift taking place within Africa's security institutions. The world is watching, and Kenya's actions may very well set a precedent for policing across Africa and beyond. As social media amplifies these movements, what happens next will depend on how political leaders, security institutions, and citizens respond to the growing call for reform. Will they use this moment to usher in a new era of accountable governance, or will they suppress the shift, maintaining the status quo? The changing relationship between the police and the people is one of the most significant transformations underway in Africa today. This single act of conscience has changed the conversation, forcing both African governments and their citizens to rethink the role of the police in society. In a world where transparency and accountability are more important than ever, the ripple effects of this moment could reshape the future of African governance. Public trust, democratic accountability, and human rights could become central to the way security forces operate, ultimately creating a new era of justice and democratic reform in Africa. As the rest of the world watches, Kenya's courage could become the spark that ignites broader change across the continent, leading to a future where policing is based on protection, inclusion, and respect for human dignity, rather than fear and coercion.